You know a game that I really need to look at playing at some point in time? A Hat in Time. Many SRB2 mods are supposedly based off the gameplay loop that game presents, itself based off the collectathon platformers of the 90s, but having never played it, they could all be completely wrong when it comes to how they feel, and I would never know. But that would cost money, and I'm frankly very cheap, so that'll stay a pipe dream for a while longer as you stick to playing SRB2 and whatever free stuff Epic Games throws at me to keep using that platform. Today's video is a preview for a character I had sent to me on Discord by the name of Aum, and in case you didn't guess from that preamble, he's based off A Hat in Time, so let's get into it. Despite never playing the game he's based on, I could immediately gather some of the basics of how Aum would play, based off a mod I've covered previously, Steph characters, namely the first character Skip the Fennec Fox. He too was based off this gameplay archetype, and so they share some common abilities and traits. They both have a mixture of verticality and speed, allowing them to explore in a wide variety of spaces and rarely getting stuck. Both have a double jump, which acts as you'd expect. You jump, and then you jump again. Both also have a slide, though that fact initially evaded me with Aum because it is map 2, of all places, custom 3, and can only be used on the ground upon reaching a certain speed. Skip in comparison can use this in the air, and it is done by pressing spin, so it is a bit more versatile there. This is where the difference in experience presumably lies. Dr. Steven, Skip's creator, has made loads of extremely high quality mods like Kiryu and Eggpack, whereas I can't see anything from Aum, so I assume this is their first mod. It means that Aum isn't quite as versatile as Skip, so he won't pull out platforming tricks on the same level, and his abilities aren't quite as deep. But that is somewhat balanced by Aum having more abilities outside of this. Whereas Skip tried to emulate A Hat in Time through his abilities, something achievable only due to Dr. Steven's comparative experience and expertise, Aum hews closer in other ways. Comparative to the standard SRB2 character, he is much slower, although I have to say it isn't to an extent where it becomes truly difficult / unfun to play, like Doomslayer or some others in the past. Rather, it's more just a slightly different way to experience the game, and unlike some others, he has the tools to remedy this lack of speed. I've already mentioned the slide, which can reach truly baffling speeds when going down some of the longer and steeper slopes of the game, but what about when there isn't a slope to speed down? Well, then you have two other abilities to play with. The Sprint, performed by holding spin while moving, and the Charge Dash, performed by holding spin when standing still. I'll start with the Sprint, because it's very simple to explain. Press spin, go faster. It's not at boost mode levels or anything, but it operates similarly, but obviously manually done, and with a shorter acceleration time before reaching a speed that I think is somewhere between standard top speed and boost mode top speed. Charge Dash is something a little more, being a spin dash of sorts. The difference between the two is that the Charge Dash, while it does blast you off at top speed, allows you to keep all of your maneuverability, which is usually lost by a spin dash, but more pressingly locks you out of jumping. This makes it a bit more situational than a standard spin dash, as while you can turn corners more easily and you can go up hills and all that as you don't lose your speed, you will eventually need to sabotage yourself and ram face first into a wall to once again regain full control over your character, which I'm not a huge fan of. It just feels kind of unnecessary, and indeed the Charge Dash as a whole is mostly outmatched by Sprint, as any time you save by not needing to accelerate to your top speed is lost by the bouncing animation that plays whenever you need to exit the mode. This brings us onto the final part of Aum's moveset, though it is a bit of a strange one. As you may expect from a Sonic fan game, most every other character, vanilla or not, will operate using the same health system. Collect rings, you're immortal as long as you hold one, but you drop them all every time you get hit, etc, etc. Aum is different, as he once again takes cues from A Hat in Time and its health system. I again don't know exactly how it works there, but here, it operates effectively as a more standard health bar, where you can get hit up to 3 times without collecting rings and still remain alive. These counts are replenished by collecting rings on the ground, but only physical rings, as those found in monitors do not count for whatever reason, with 1 ring equivalent to 1 hit. You do not drop rings when you get hit, so you can't completely cheese the system by just collecting those and replenishing counts, but the fact that each count only needs a single ring to be replenished means that outside of bosses, you never need to worry about dying. In bosses, due to some problems we'll get to very shortly, what would otherwise help to make most of the fights more challenging actually becomes a serious flaw, but again, get to it shortly. The only other thing to do with Alm's unique health is that getting hit seems to be a viable strategy to get further and higher in some situations, as regardless of whether you get hit in the air or on the ground, Alm will play the same animation, before going through the enemy entirely, rather than bouncing back like usual. I'm fairly certain that it also reset your double jump, which could of course lead to some interesting speedrunning strategies, albeit quite situational ones. For a mod made by someone fairly new to the scene, and still indubitably an in-development one, Alm has so far batted pretty well, with an interesting moveset that, while by no means perfect, feels like it is getting somewhere and has its unique properties that sets it apart from even those trying to emulate the same gameplay style. I don't think it's quite the best version of that archetype, Skip has absolutely taken the cake on that one, but it's done quite well for itself. However, the cracks begin to appear in two pretty big ways that do really harm Alm, and not in the annoying little quality of life problem either. These are two problems that can soft lock you in some stages or force you to go find complex alternate routes to try and surpass them, though in many stages that still is not enough. The first one is that the damage hitbox in Alm's jump is seemingly pretty busted, which isn't so bad most of the time, but really rears its ugly head against bosses. Essentially, Alm does have a damaging jump, but it is quite inconsistent, and when fighting some enemies, especially bosses, you can oftentimes get damage when hitting the enemy, or even have your attack cancelled out entirely. It seems to usually remedy itself by double jumping, but that's a bizarre workaround, seeing there's no indication that it should change anything about your damage hitbox. I assume it just means that in most cases, you're above the damage hitbox of the boss, so it doesn't hurt you, but still. Come on. The second, and certainly bigger one as it does stop Alm from completing the game, is his inability to use several level gimmicks. Certain level props that force you into a particular stage do not play well with Alm, and in many cases will stop you from proceeding. I've seen it occur with the ropes in Arid Canyon and the boulders in Red Volcano, but the most pressing one is his inability to use these things in Castle Eggman. Once you've entered these, you cannot leave them but also cannot use them, forcing you to reset the level and try to find a different path. In Castle Eggman specifically though, this soft locks you entirely, as you simply cannot proceed without using at least one of these, especially in the final segment of Act 2. These two problems are the most pressing ones across the whole project and are the ones that absolutely need to be fixed before I can recommend Alm be released publicly. Graphically speaking? Look, Alm isn't a particularly graphically complex character, there's no way to get around that. He doesn't fit into the SRB2 aesthetic at all, he isn't particularly well animated, his clothes lack any weight considering that his scarf would be the perfect thing to animate to give the sprite some dynamism, and his design doesn't lend itself particularly well to any of these problems being fixed in the future. His effects don't make any sense when compared to the rest of the character, being iridescent when the entirety of the rest of the design is using greys, blacks and oranges, and even his health icon looks like something you'd see in Pizza Tower, which certainly isn't the appearance that the rest of his sprites have. Alm told me that the sprites weren't complete when he DM'd me the mod, and I'm not sure whether they'll realistically much improve in the future either. But honestly, I'm not too annoyed. An SRB2 mod is always going to be a personal endeavour, and it's admirable that someone who doesn't necessarily have the tools needed to make professional sprites will still go out there and release the mod to the public, regardless of whether the sprites are particularly great. It's probably a pretty good thing for Alm that I'm putting this down as a preview, because these would not be getting a good score, but I'd like to tell people that regardless of what scores I give a mod, being able to release the mod in any form should be considered a victory and a job well done. And hey, every so often, Alm does get a sprite that shows off some of their personality, and that's a lot more than some other mods get. Overall, I'm pretty happy with being able to preview Alm. Is he the best character I've covered on this channel? No. Is he the best in development character I've been given the honour to play? No. But is he a better beginning mod than a lot of other first attempts I've played, with a more unique moveset and some ambition to be a little more than just a vanilla Sonic with a homing attack and boost mode? Yeah, and that's quite frankly good enough for me. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily try and emulate a gameplay style so very different to the standard SRB2 experience without a fair degree of prior experience, and while he isn't the most polished attempt at a hat in time, he's still different enough to be recognisable in a crowd of characters that otherwise play much the same. He needs a lot of work still, namely with the 2 massive problems he currently has and some further sprite development, but I'm sure he'll be a fun time when he does end up on the SRB2 message boards. Thank you to Am for allowing me to preview their mod, thank you to everyone who watched this video, and ciao.